Hard-coded into the DNA of Kelly Lee Owens' self-titled debut are the traits of a number of other artists. It has the analog warmth of Aphex Twin, the vocal sensibilities of Grimes, and the reflective mood of Mum, to name a few. But while Kelly Lee Owens sounds like a lot of other things, she doesn't sound too close to any one of these other artists to hamper the experience of her music, managing to carve out her own unique space amongst her influences and contemporaries. Owens is focused on crafting mood more than anything else. Simple, sparse instrumentation and reverb-drenched vocals create a surprising sense of intimacy. The songs are simple, but constructed well enough to be constantly engaging. But while Kelly Lee Owens doesn't labour on any idea long enough to wear out its welcome, conversely, it's hard to feel like you've really moved anywhere once it's over. Indeed, more broadly, while there's an audible coherence throughout the album, the individual tracks don't really seem to have much of a relationship to one another, aside from the shared aesthetic. There aren't any real risks or surprises in the songwriting here, but that works to Kelly Lee Owens' favour, carefully eliciting a specific mode of listening. It's an impressively atmospheric debut, however, it may well come up short for those looking for a more actively engaging experience. Aviva, is there enough substance on display here?
I personally don't think so. I thought the album was good, but it definitely had a real already heard atmosphere about it. And this is one of my biggest problems with the electronica genre in general. And it's something that I experience with a lot of the artists that you mentioned as potential influencers of KLO's debut album. And it's something that I've experienced when listening to Grimes and Aphex Twin, in that if I'm not in the right mood for it, it's really difficult for me to invest into what I'm listening to. And I guess you could say that for a lot of albums, especially if they're atmospheric, I guess. But with the whole dream pop genre with which I believe she is engaging, it's really hard for me to sit down and listen to it unless I'm cognitively there or emotionally there as well. And that's something I struggled with this album.
See, I think for me it actually works in the opposite, where it's actually easier for me to listen to this if I'm not actively engaging, because when you actively engage with it, you kind of realize that there's not a lot of meat on the bones here. But if you just have it as a passive listening experience, then, I don't know, I found that a far more engaging way to listen to the music here. It sets a very consistent mood throughout, and it really favors kind of dropping in and out of focus with the album rather than actively engaging with any material here, which, I don't know, I think that speaks to not being substance-less, but certainly not having a great deal of depth.
Right. See, I can think of other artists that I probably passively listen to. Geotic is what I would consider a passive listening experience for me, and I would say that because I don't think that the music or the vocals are intrusive. I can have it on in the background, and pretty much no matter what I'm doing, it's fine. It can be turned up, and I can switch on to active listening, or I can switch off to passive listening. Do you know what I mean? It's like I have that freedom of choice.
Yep.
But my issue with this album is that I didn't feel that I had a freedom of choice. I don't think that there is an active way of listening to her music, but because the tracks were so different, you know, it seemed almost like a collection of singles and not one well thought out, well mapped out album. I had a difficult time relaxing into it because the varied tempos did nothing to create an emotional atmosphere for me. If an album starts off a certain way, I want it to either leave me at an emotional stasis or take me through some sort of transportation in which I am on this journey, and at the end of the journey, I'm either exactly where I started off, where I began, or I'm in a slightly different place because this album has elicited an affect response from me. And this album did neither of those things. It did not take me on a journey in which I felt transformed by the end, but I also did not feel transported back to where I began. I just felt sort of at odds.
Yeah, it is kind of a jarring experience in that sense, where you have quite similar materials throughout, and yet the way that they're packaged and presented can be quite jarring, or just seems to lack a lot of forethought as to how they're arranged in the context of the album.
It felt like I was reading a book out of order.
Yeah, it definitely has that vibe to it. I don't think that's a problem listening to it on a track-by-track basis.
No, absolutely not.
But yeah, it's definitely a bit of an ask to actively engage with this album. For what it's worth, though, I think that the way that things are arranged and the way things are presented, it seems very focused on making you engage in sort of a piecemeal appreciation of moments.
I'd agree with that. I think that individual tracks were really strong. And I know at some point you mentioned that you felt that the instrumentation was a bit sparse. And I would agree with that, but I'd also say that in this situation, I think it demonstrated a sense of refinement in her choice of orchestration. I think it had a very chamber-like feel on certain tracks. And I think that there was a great deal of intention in terms of every single sound or sonic landscape that was created was very intentional. And I think that that demonstrates confidence and knowledge on Kelly Lee Owens's part as to which sound should be included.
Yeah, the sparseness is interesting, and it's hard to do minimal electronic music well without either sounding derivative or sounding uninspired, or like you just don't have sort of a depth of sound to draw upon to make it sound engaging. And Kelly Lee Owens really gets away from that. Every single minimal sound that she uses seems to be quite a deliberate choice. And hanging that on very simplistic, straightforward structures and songwriting, I think, is certainly to the advantage of the album. But it does end up in this space where, you know, there are no risks, there are no surprises, there's nothing there that makes you sort of stand up and pay attention.
Right.
Instead, you have to sit back into this sort of more passive experience of the album.
So much of it was a dead ringer for Grimes' Halfaxa era, which is, you know, one of her first efforts to be released. So I did like the dreamy vibes and the sort of shimmering vocals over unexpected percussive sounds. But I don't know, I didn't really dig the tempo mixing. I thought that upset some of the stronger moods of the album when I would sort of settle into a passivity and then all of a sudden the tempo would change, but it wasn't a welcome energizer. It was almost an annoyance.
I think it's a strong debut.
Absolutely.
And it's got some really interesting ideas to be expanded on, and her production skills are absolutely spot on. And it's interesting because often the debut album is, you know, theoretically supposed to be the strongest offering from an artist, traditionally speaking, because it's this sort of percolation and release of sort of the most pure idea of who and what they are.
Yeah.
And I think that if that's the case here, it's going to be a bit of a disappointment for future releases. But she definitely has something. I think there's definite potential for this to develop into quite a rewarding project down the line.